The word hell appears in your Bible hundreds of times. You have read it. You have heard it preached. You have built an entire picture in your mind of what it is and where it is and who goes there. But here is what almost no one tells you from the front of a church. The Bible was not written in English, and in the languages it was actually written in, Hebrew and Greek, the word hell does not exist as a single, unified concept. Not once, not anywhere. What you were handed is one English word standing in for 4 entirely different words from 2 different languages. The King James translators took 4 distinct things and rendered them all with the same 3 letters. And the moment they did, you stopped being able to see the difference. Now, here is what I need you to understand. This is not a small detail. This is not a footnote for scholars. Jesus himself spoke about the realm beyond death 15 separate times across the first 3 Gospels. 11 of those times he used one word. 4 of those times he used a completely different word. He did not reach for the same term over and over. He chose specific words in specific moments for specific reasons, the way every careful teacher chooses his words. Gehenna 11 times, Hades 4 times. 2 different words for 2 different things. And when you collapse all of them into the single English word, hell, you do not just lose a little precision. You collapse everything he was actually saying. You flatten an entire landscape into one dot. So in this video, you are going to discover 3 different words. 3, each one with its own meaning, each one with its own history, each one with its own place in what Jesus actually taught. And there is a 4th word, too, one Jesus never used at all, that got swept into the same English word along with the rest. And I am not going to give you my opinion. I am going to take you to the text, word by word, and show you what is sitting there in plain sight underneath the English. And by the time we reach the 3rd word, you will understand something most pastors will never say out loud. The most widely taught version of hell in Western Christianity is not the version that came from the mouth of Jesus. It came through a long chain of translation, century after century, language handed to language, until 4 words became one. And I am going to show you every link in that chain. But stay with me, because the 3rd word is the one that matters most. The 3rd word is the one Jesus used 11 times. And it is not a theological abstraction. It is the name of a real place, a place with dirt and rock and a history, a place you could stand in today if you booked a flight, a place so disturbing in its past that when Jesus said its name out loud, every single person in his audience already knew exactly what he meant. He did not have to explain it. The horror was already in the word. Stay until the 3rd word, because the 3rd word changes how you hear every warning Jesus ever gave. Before we get to Jesus, we have to go back, because Jesus did not appear out of nowhere. He was a Jewish teacher, soaked from childhood in the Hebrew scriptures, quoting them constantly, thinking inside their categories. And in those Hebrew scriptures, the scriptures Jesus grew up reading, there was only one word for the place the dead go. One word. That word is Sheol. Now, here is the first thing you have to understand about Sheol, and it is the thing that should stop you. In the Hebrew Bible, Sheol is the destination of all the dead. Not the wicked dead, not the condemned dead, all of them, righteous and wicked alike. It is the realm of the dead, the grave, the place beneath, where every human life was understood to go down at its end. It was not a courtroom. It was not a torture chamber. It was the shared destiny of every person who ever drew breath. Look at how the translators handled it. Sheol appears 65 times in the Hebrew Bible. 65 times. And in the King James Version, the very same word, the identical Hebrew word in the identical kind of text, is rendered hell 31 times, the grave 31 times, and the pit 3 times. Think about what that means. The same word. One translation committee. And they reached into their English and pulled out hell in one verse and the grave in the next, based on nothing in the original text, because in the original text there is no difference. The difference is manufactured entirely in English. The word underneath every one of those choices is one and the same. Now here is where this gets impossible to ignore. Because if Sheol is hell, if Sheol is the place of eternal torment your church described, then you have a serious problem with what Genesis chapter 37, verse 35 records. There is a grieving father, one of the covenant patriarchs of Israel, the ancestral founders of the entire nation. He believes his beloved son is dead, torn apart by a wild animal. And in his grief he says, "I will go down to Sheol, mourning for my son." Read that again and let it land. This is not a wicked man being threatened with punishment. This is one of the founding fathers of Israel, a man God himself made covenant promises to, calmly stating where he expects to go when he dies. He was not afraid of Sheol. No one threatened him with it. He simply expected to arrive there. And Genesis is not alone. In Psalm 89, verse 48, the same expectation is lifted up as a universal question about every human being who has ever lived. The text asks, "What man can live and not see death? Who can deliver his soul from the power of Sheol?" That is a rhetorical question, and it expects exactly one answer. No one. Not the righteous, not the wicked. Everyone goes down. The question is not who ends up in Sheol. Everyone does. The question is whether anyone can ever escape it. So here is the question the translation forces on you, and I want you to sit with it. If Sheol is hell, if it is the place of eternal fiery torment, then why is a covenant patriarch walking calmly toward it, with no fear at all? Why does an entire psalm treat it as the ordinary, universal destination of every human soul that has ever existed? There is only one answer that fits the text. In the Hebrew Bible, Sheol is not a place of punishment. It is the place of the dead. All of the dead. And the English word hell cannot carry that meaning. It never could. Now, here is where the story of this word gets more complicated and more interesting, because Sheol does not stay locked inside the Hebrew language. Around 250 years before Christ, a group of Jewish scholars in Alexandria, in Egypt, began the enormous work of translating the entire Hebrew scriptures into Greek. That translation is called the Septuagint, and it became the Bible of the Greek-speaking Jewish world. And when those scholars came to the word Sheol, when they needed a Greek word to carry this Hebrew concept of the realm of all the dead, they reached into their own language and picked the word that already meant the realm of the dead in their world. They chose Hades. Now, here is what I need you to understand about that single decision, because it shapes everything that comes after. The New Testament was not written in Hebrew. The New Testament was written in Greek, and more than 70% of the Old Testament quotations that appear in the New Testament follow the wording of that Greek Septuagint, not the original Hebrew. Let that land. When the New Testament writers reached back to their scriptures, the version in their hands, the version on their tongues, was the Greek one, which means that when they thought about the realm of the dead, the word already sitting in their minds was Hades, the Greek word that had, for nearly 3 centuries, been the standard translation of the Hebrew Sheol. The link was already forged. Hebrew Sheol had become Greek Hades long before a single line of the New Testament was written, and this is exactly where Jesus walks into the picture. Because when the Gospels record Jesus speaking about the realm of the dead, he is speaking to people who read their scriptures in Greek, people who knew Hades as the word for Sheol, people who carried that whole inheritance in the back of their minds. And Jesus used that word, Hades, exactly 4 times, 4, And what he actually said in those 4 moments is almost certainly not what your church has told you it means. It is not a place of fire and screaming as a final sentence. It is something stranger, and in one case, it is something that should bring you to your knees. But before we go there, I have to stop for one moment, because if this is already cracking something open for you, if you have genuinely never heard any of this before, then do something right now. Hit that like button. I know it sounds small, but every single time you do it, this message is carried a little further, and one more person who was handed the same flattened picture you were handed gets the chance to hear what you are hearing right now. And subscribe and turn on your notifications, because this series is going to take you deeper into what the Bible actually says, word by word, than most churches will ever be willing to go. Now, let me show you what Jesus did with the word Hades, because the realm his own scriptures called the destination of every soul is the realm he stepped into and walked back out of. And once you see how he used the word, you will never read it the same way again. Hades appears 10 times in the New Testament. 10. And here is the thing you have to see about the King James Version. Every single one of those 10 occurrences is translated with the same English word, hell. All 10. There is no differentiation, no signal to the reader that anything specific is being said. It is just hell, 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 10 times over. But open a modern translation, the New International Version, the English Standard Version, the New American Standard, and you will find something different. They restore the actual Greek word. They print Hades. And they do that for a reason. The scholars who produced those translations recognized that rendering this word hell creates a false equivalence, a confusion that the text itself directly and openly contradicts. Now, here is the moment where the translation problem becomes impossible to explain away. I want you to go to the book of Revelation, chapter 20, verses 13 and 14. Listen carefully to the exact sequence the text describes. It says, "And the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one of them, according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire." Read it slowly. Hear the order of events. The dead come out. Then the judgment happens. Then Hades itself is thrown into the lake of fire. And I need you to hear what that text is actually saying, because it is not subtle once you see it. Hades gives up its dead. The dead come out of Hades to stand before judgment. And then, after that, Hades itself, the place, is thrown into the lake of fire. That is not one event. That is 2 sequential events, in order, one after the other. First the dead come out of Hades, then Hades is destroyed, which means Hades and the lake of fire cannot be the same place. They cannot be. You cannot throw something into itself. You cannot cast Hades into Hades. The text draws a hard line between the realm where the dead wait and the lake of fire that comes at the end. They are 2 different things, the text says so plainly. But your Bible, if you are reading the King James, calls both of them by the same English word. Hell. Hades is hell. And the place of final fire gets called hell too. And the instant you do that, the instant you flatten both of them into one word, the sequence vanishes. The distinction the text was so careful to make becomes invisible to you. You read hell, and your mind merges them into one place when the original is showing you 2. That is not a small loss. That is the loss of the entire structure the writer built. 2 distinct realities, the waiting place of the dead and the final fire, pressed flat into a single English syllable until you could no longer tell them apart. The word choice did not just blur a detail, it erased an argument, And once that argument disappears, you can no longer see what the text was telling you about where the dead actually go and what actually waits at the end. Now let me take you to exactly what Jesus said, each of the 4 times he used the word Hades. The first is in Matthew chapter 11, verse 23. Jesus is pronouncing judgment on the city of Capernaum, a town that had seen his miracles and refused him. And he says, "And you, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heaven? You will be brought down to Hades." Notice precisely what he is doing. He is describing the fate of a condemned city, brought down, lowered, humbled into the realm of the dead. It is not a description of a specific torture chamber with named torments. It is a condemned descent into the realm of the dead. That is the word, and that is the picture the word carries. The second time is in Matthew 16, verse 18, and this one should stop you completely, because it is not a warning at all. It is a promise. Jesus says, "On this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it." Hear that. Jesus is not threatening anyone with Hades here. He is telling his disciples that Hades, the realm of death itself, does not have the strength to hold back what he is building. That is the language of resurrection. That is the language of death being overpowered, and he says it using the exact word his audience knew as the realm of the dead. The third use is in Luke chapter 16, in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. The rich man dies, and the text says that in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes. Now, I want to be careful here. This is a parable, and it is the one place in all of Jesus' teaching where someone in Hades experiences something that looks like torment. There is honest disagreement among careful scholars about whether Jesus is giving a literal map of Hades here, or whether he is borrowing a familiar parabolic structure to drive home a moral point about wealth and indifference to the suffering poor. But here is what is not in dispute. The word. The word is Hades, not Gehenna, not the lake of fire. And even inside this parable, Hades is a holding state before the final judgment, not the final destination itself. But here is the detail that lands hardest of all, the one almost no one has ever pointed out to you. In Acts chapter 2, a speaker quotes from Psalm 16, verse 10, and applies it directly to Jesus. He says, "You will not abandon my soul to Hades, nor let your Holy One see corruption." And then the text explains the meaning. It says this was spoken about the resurrection of Christ, that he was not abandoned to Hades, nor did his flesh see corruption. Stop and absorb that. Jesus went to Hades. The New Testament states it directly, in plain words. He went to the realm of the dead. And he was not left there. He was raised out of it, which tells you, beyond any argument, what Hades actually is. It is the realm the dead enter. It is the place that the resurrection of Jesus reached into and broke open. It is not a permanent torment chamber for the damned. It is the realm of death itself, and Jesus walked into it and walked back out. So let me show you exactly where we are standing now, because 2 of the words are already on the table. Sheol, in the Hebrew. The realm of all the dead, righteous and wicked alike, the place a covenant patriarch expected to go without fear. Hades, in the Greek. The Septuagint's chosen word for Sheol carried straight into the New Testament, used by Jesus himself 4 times, and used by the New Testament of Jesus himself when he descended into death and rose again. And in the book of Revelation, Hades is thrown into the lake of fire, which means, beyond any argument, that Hades and the lake of fire are not the same thing. 2 different words, in 2 different languages, for one realm of the dead. Your Bible may print the same English word over all of it. The original texts never did. Not once. They kept the words distinct, because the words meant distinct things. But here is what I haven't shown you yet. Because the word Jesus reached for the most, the word he returned to again and again when he spoke about judgment and consequence, is not Sheol, and it is not Hades. It is a third word. A word he used 11 separate times across 3 different Gospels. A word that almost no Christian has ever been taught to look at by itself, on its own terms. And it is a word with a history, a real, physical, documented history, so dark that once you know it, you can never again hear Jesus use it the same way. It changes the sound of every warning that contains it. The word is Gehenna. And here is the part that surprises people. To understand what Jesus meant by it, you do not need a degree in theology. You need a map of Jerusalem. Because Gehenna, in the original Hebrew, Ge-Hinnom, the Valley of Hinnom, is not an abstract concept. It is a place. A real valley with real geography on the southern and western edges of the ancient city of Jerusalem. A valley that was still there in Jesus' own day. A valley his listeners could have walked down to in an afternoon. When Jesus said the word, he was naming a location they all knew, the way you would name a street in your own town. And that valley, by the time Jesus used its name as a warning, was carrying a weight of history that every Jewish person in his audience would have felt in their gut the instant the word left his mouth. Because something happened in that valley. Something terrible. Something that God himself, in the book of Jeremiah, said he never commanded, and that never even entered his mind. Something that the kings of Israel, God's own appointed rulers, allowed to happen at the very edge of the holy city. And understanding what that something was is the only way to understand what Jesus was actually saying when he said Gehenna. It is the difference between hearing a vague threat about the afterlife and hearing a word soaked in real blood and real fire and real history. So let me take you down into that valley. Let me show you what happened there, who allowed it, and why the memory of it still burned in every mind that heard Jesus speak. In the beginning, the valley of Hinnom is nothing. In the book of Joshua, chapters 15 and 18, it appears only as a property boundary, a marker drawn between the tribal territory of Judah and the tribal territory of Benjamin. That is all it is at first. Geography, a valley with a name. But then something changes, and it changes everything. In 2 Chronicles chapter 28, verse 3, one of the kings of Judah, one of God's own anointed rulers, takes his children to a site within that valley called the Tophet, and there he burns them as an offering to the foreign god Moloch. The text does not soften it. It says plainly that he burned his children as an offering in the valley of the son of Hinnom. Not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech, his own children in the fire, and that king was not alone. In 2 Chronicles chapter 33, verse 6, a later king of Judah does the very same thing. He burned his sons as an offering in the valley of the son of Hinnom. This was not one isolated horror. This burning of children in this valley was repeated, a site of recurring atrocity against the innocent, right against the wall of Jerusalem itself. And God's response, recorded in the book of Jeremiah, is one of the most direct statements of pure divine horror in the entire Old Testament. Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 31. God says, "They have built the high places of Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I did not command, nor did it come into my mind." Hear those final words. He does not merely call it sin. He says it never came into his mind. The thing was so foreign to his heart that he distances himself from it completely. Then comes King Josiah, born around 648 years before Christ, reigning from roughly 640 to 609. Josiah does something deliberate to that valley. 2 Kings chapter 23, verse 10. The text says, "He defiled Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, so that no one might burn his son or his daughter as an offering to Moloch. He could not undo what had happened there. He could only make the place itself permanently unclean, so that no one would ever use it for that horror again. And then, in the centuries between the Hebrew Bible and the birth of Jesus, the centuries called the Second Temple period, something happened in the Jewish imagination. This real, defiled, blood-soaked valley was transformed into an image. Jewish literature took Gehenna and turned it into a picture of the place where the wicked face final judgment. A writing from that period, the book of 4th Ezra, describes Gehenna in exactly those terms, and the imagery came straight from the prophet Isaiah, from chapter 66, verse 24, the very last verse in the entire book, which describes a place of dead bodies where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. So when Jesus stood in Galilee and said the word Gehenna, he was not inventing a new theological term. He was reaching for a word his audience already carried like a stone in their chest. They knew the valley. They knew its history, the children, the fire, the horror, God said, never entered his mind. They knew the prophetic imagery that had grown up around it. He did not need to explain a single bit of it. He only needed to say the name, and the whole weight of it landed on them at once. Now here is what I need you to understand about the word Gehenna. Jesus used it 11 times. 11. In Matthew, in Mark, in Luke. It is, without competition, the word he reached for more than any other when he spoke about judgment and consequence. Not Hades, which he used 4 times. Not Sheol, which he never uses at all in the Gospels. Gehenna, 11 times. 3 of those uses come from a single sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew chapter 5. In verse 22, Jesus says that anyone who calls his brother a fool will be liable to the Gehenna of fire. In verse 29, it is better to lose an eye than for your whole body to be thrown into Gehenna. And in verse 30, he says the same of a hand. Notice what he is doing. He is not describing the cosmos. He is making a moral argument to living people about their anger, their lust, their contempt. He is saying the stakes of your everyday choices are as serious as Gehenna. Then, in Matthew chapter 10, verse 28, Jesus says, "Fear him who can destroy both soul and body in Gehenna." Listen to the word he uses. Destroy. Both soul and body. Not merely to punish without end, but to destroy. That is the verb he reaches for, and most people have never noticed it. And then 2 of the most striking uses of all, in Matthew chapter 23, in the middle of Jesus' fiercest indictment of the religious authorities. In verse 15, he tells them they make a convert, twice as much a child of Gehenna as themselves. And in verse 33, "You serpents, you brood of vipers, how are you to escape being sentenced to Gehenna?" Hear who he is saying this to. Not to pagans, to the religious leaders, the men who taught the scriptures, the men who controlled the temple. In Mark chapter 9, he uses the word 3 times in rapid succession. Better to enter life without a hand, without a foot, with a single eye, than to be thrown into Gehenna, into what the text calls the unquenchable fire. And there he quotes from Isaiah chapter 66, "Where their worm does not die, and the fire is not quenched." That imagery is from a valley, a physical valley, with bodies and fire. That is the weight the word is carrying every time he says it. If you are seeing this for the first time, if no one has ever once walked you through what Jesus actually said and which word he actually chose, then share this video right now with someone who needs to hear it. There is somebody in your life who was handed the same flattened picture you were handed. Send it to them. And subscribe, because the 4th word, the last one, is the one that ties this whole thing together and shows you how all of it got collapsed into one. Now, here is what I need you to see across all 11 uses, because this is the heart of it. Every single time Jesus used the word Gehenna, he was speaking to living people, about choices they were making right then, in their own lives, in their own bodies, about anger, about lust, about hypocrisy, about the treatment of the poor. It is a warning image, drawn from a real place of horror, held up in front of the living. It is not a geography lesson about the afterlife. He is not drawing you a map of where the dead go. He is standing in front of living human beings and saying, what you do with your anger, your desire, your hypocrisy, your treatment of the vulnerable, it carries the weight of that valley, 11 times, every time. A warning to the living, not a tour of the dead. There is one more layer to this word that I have to show you before we can tell the full story of how the popular doctrine of hell was actually built. And it takes us back to the prophet Isaiah, to the very last verse in his entire book, chapter 66, verse 24. This is the verse Jesus quoted in Mark chapter 9. Listen to exactly what it says. Those who serve God shall go out and look on the dead bodies of the men who have rebelled against me. For their worm shall not die, their fire shall not be quenched, and they shall be an abhorrence to all flesh. That is the source. That is the original image standing behind Jesus' Gehenna language. Now hear what that passage is actually describing, because the words matter. It says, dead bodies, corpses, people going out to look upon dead bodies being consumed. The worm that does not die is the worm consuming dead flesh. The fire that is not quenched is the fire burning through refuse and remains. The picture is one of total destruction, of ruin, of shame, the fate of corpses in a place of disgrace. That is the scene Jesus is quoting when he speaks of the Gehenna, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. He is reaching for an image of total, final destruction and public shame. He is not describing living people kept conscious forever in perpetual agony. He is quoting a scene of corpses in a defiled valley. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the point where serious, scripture-honoring people genuinely disagree, and I am not going to pretend that disagreement does not exist. There is a real and honest debate between those who hold to eternal conscious torment and those who hold that Gehenna points to final destruction rather than endless suffering. God-fearing believers stand on both sides of that question, and I am not here to hand you the answer to it as though it were simple. But here is what is not in dispute, and here is what this whole video is actually about. The word Gehenna is not the word Hades, the word Gehenna is not the word Sheol, and the word Gehenna is not the English word hell, the way most churches have used it, as one single permanent fiery place that supposedly runs unchanged from the first chapter of Genesis all the way to the last page of Revelation. Whatever you conclude about the duration of judgment, that flattening is not what the text says. And before we leave Gehenna entirely, one more detail you should have. There are 12 total uses of the word Gehenna in the entire New Testament. 11 of them are Jesus speaking. Only one comes from anyone else. It is in the letter of James, chapter 3, verse 6, where the writer says that the tongue is set on fire by Gehenna. And look at what he does with it. Even outside the Gospels, even in the one place where someone other than Jesus uses the word, it is still a moral image. The destructive power of the human tongue is likened to the fire of that valley. It is still a warning aimed at how living people speak and live. 12 uses, 11 from Jesus, all of them warnings to the living. 1 from James, also a warning to the living. Not a single one of them is a guided tour of the afterlife. Now there is a fourth word. The King James Bible uses hell in one more place in the New Testament, and this one is unlike any of the others we have looked at. It is not Hebrew. It is not part of the Old Testament tradition at all. It has nothing to do with Sheol or the realm of the dead. This word comes straight out of Greek mythology. In Greek cosmology, Tartarus is the abyss that lies below Hades, the deepest pit of the underworld, the prison where the Titans were chained. That is the world this word comes from. Not Jerusalem, not the Hebrew prophets, Greek myth, and it appears exactly once in the entire New Testament. Once. In the second letter of Peter, chapter 2, verse 4, the author writes, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into Tartarus, and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment." That word, the verb behind "cast them into Tartarus," is Tartaru, and the King James translates that whole phrase as "cast them down to hell." One word again, hell. Standing in for a Greek mythological term about a pit below the underworld. And notice the specifics. It occurs one time. It is used of fallen angels, not of human beings. It is written by the author of 2 Peter, not spoken by Jesus. Jesus never used this word at all, and it is borrowed from pagan Greek cosmology. And yet your Bible files it under the same 3 letters as everything else. Hell, the same word it used for the Hebrew realm of the dead. The same word it used for the valley outside Jerusalem. A pagan term for the prison of the Titans, flattened into the very same English syllable, until you could no longer tell that it had ever been anything different at all. So that is the complete picture now. 4 entirely different words, swallowed by one. Sheol, the Hebrew realm of all the dead, where every human being was understood to go down. Hades, its Greek equivalent in the New Testament, the realm Jesus himself entered in death and rose out of. Gehenna, a real valley of horror outside Jerusalem that Jesus used as a moral warning to the living 11 times. And Tartaru, a Greek mythological term for the prison of the Titans, used a single time about fallen angels, never once by Jesus. 4 words, 4 histories, 4 meanings, and 1 English word, hell, sitting on top of all of them, hiding every difference. If this is stirring something in you right now, if you are beginning to see that the Bible you were handed has been translated in ways that carry real consequences for what you actually believe, then subscribe right now. And leave a comment below and tell me this. Which one of these 4 words hit you the hardest? Sheol, Hades, Gehenna, or Tartaru? I read them because what comes next is the part almost no one ever thinks to ask about. How did we get here? How did 1 English word come to stand in for 4 completely different words from 2 different languages? Who made that choice, and when, and why? And what does it mean for everything your church has ever taught you about where the dead go? That is exactly where we are going next. Now, here is how it actually happened. Around the year 382, a scholar named Jerome, born around 347 in the region of Dalmatia, was commissioned to produce the first great comprehensive Latin translation of the entire Bible. That translation is called the Vulgate, completed around 405. And Jerome did into Latin what the King James translators would later do into English: the Hebrew Sheol, the Greek Hades, the Greek Gehenna. All of them began blurring together under Latin words for the underworld. And from Jerome's Latin, the English word hell, drawn from the old Germanic underworld traditions, would eventually inherit all of it at once. But before the Vulgate locked the Latin tradition into place, there is a fact most Christians have never been told. Historians who have studied the early Christian world have noted that of the major theological schools active in those first centuries, only one consistently taught the doctrine of eternal conscious torment as we know it. 1. The Latin-speaking school in North Africa. Several of the others taught universal restoration. At least one taught that the wicked are finally destroyed rather than tormented forever. Now, I want to be honest with you. That way of counting the schools comes from one particular historian, and not every scholar frames it the same way. But the underlying point stands. The early church was not unified on this. The school that became dominant in the West had an early voice in Tertullian, who lived from around 155 to 240. He embraced eternal conscious torment, grounding it in the doctrine of the natural immortality of the soul. And notice this, that idea has far deeper roots in Greek philosophy, in Plato, than in the Hebrew scriptures. And then comes the decisive figure. From 354 to 430, the man who formalized it for all of Western Christianity, Augustine of Hippo. Augustine explicitly rejected the universalist view taught by Origen, an earlier theologian born around 185, who had argued that all souls would finally be reconciled. Augustine argued forcefully for eternal conscious torment in the city of God. And through him, that position hardened into the settled baseline of the West. I am not telling you these men were liars. They were serious men making serious choices that had enormous consequences. The problem is not a villain. The problem is a chain. And in 1611, the King James Bible completes that chain. The translators took all four of those original words and rendered them with a single English word: hell, every time, for Sheol, for Hades, for Gehenna, for Tartaru. So let me lay it out one final time. Sheol, 65 times, the realm of all the dead, a covenant patriarch expecting to go there without fear. Hades, 10 times, the realm Jesus entered and rose out of, thrown into the lake of fire in Revelation, which proves it is not the lake of fire. Gehenna, 12 times, 11 from Jesus, the real valley where children were burned, used as a warning to the living. And Tartaru, 1 time, about angels, not from Jesus. Now that is the evidence, the textual record, the historical record, the linguistic record, laid out as honestly as I know how. But there is one question none of it can answer for you, and it is the only one that finally matters. What are you going to do with it? Everything we have covered today, the 4 words, the translation history, the valley, the doctrine, I did not show you any of it to frighten you. I need you to hear that. Not one piece of it was meant to make you afraid. I showed it to you because you deserve to know what was actually said. Because the God described in those pages is not a God who hides the truth about himself inside translation choices. And the Jesus who used Gehenna 11 times as a warning to the living was not trying to terrorize people into compliance. He was telling them something. What you do with your life matters. It matters at a level that carries the weight of that valley. And now I need to speak to someone specifically. Someone who has been listening to all of this, and somewhere in the middle of it, something began to move in your chest. Not discomfort, not just curiosity about ancient words. Something heavier, something that feels like being found. Because if there is a God who made these words, who chose specific words in Hebrew and Greek, and set them in a specific order for a specific reason, then those words are not just sitting in a book. They are reaching toward you, right now. So let me give you the one promise that was never hidden in translation. Paul wrote in Romans chapter 10, verse 9, "If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved." That is the promise. Not complicated. Not buried under 1,500 years of doctrine. And here is the wonder of it. The same Jesus who used Gehenna 11 times as a warning, he is the very one who walked into Hades, into the realm of the dead itself, and came back out. He went through it ahead of you. If that is you today, if you have never once said yes to him, then say it right now, wherever you are. You do not need a church building. You do not need a pastor in front of you. Just say it. Jesus, I confess with my mouth that you are Lord. I believe in my heart that God raised you from the dead. I am yours. And then write in the comments right now. Not because typing words earns you anything, because it does not, but because confession matters. Because saying it out loud and in the open is part of how faith takes hold. Right, I said yes. Or, if you are not there yet, right, I am still asking. Both of those are honest. Both of those are welcome here. And if this video opened something for you today, if the words Sheol and Hades and Gehenna mean something different to you now than they did when you pressed play, then hit that like button so this goes further. Subscribe and turn on your notifications. Share it with someone who has been quietly wrestling with what the Bible actually says about where the dead go. Because this series is not finished, there is more. The words of the Bible were not written in English. They were written in Hebrew and Greek, by people who felt the full weight of every single word they chose. And those words, chosen and preserved across 3,000 years, are still speaking, still pointing, still reaching for anyone who will let them in. The God who made those words made you, and he is not finished with you.